Good evening, everyone. By my clock, it's 7 o'clock. If we know anything about Native people and Black people, it's we are extremely on time all the time. So, just going to lean into that stereotype tonight. I'm so excited to have all of you here, both in the room and in the virtual space. My name is Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, and along with my colleague, who you will meet in just a few minutes, Reverend Pamela Gojiri, we are the co-directors for racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches, and it is our distinct honor to welcome you all here today. I want to invite a very good friend and colleague, Reverend Dwayne Davis, to come and give us some words of welcome on behalf of the space we are in right now. And so Reverend Dr. Dwayne Davis, he earned those degrees, you better give them to him, right? Would you please come and give us some welcome?
Plymouth Congregational Church gratefully acknowledges that we are on the sacred traditional territory of the Dakota people. It is an honor to live, pray, seek justice, and create community alongside Dakota, Ojibwe, and other indigenous people in the Twin Cities. I am Reverend Dwayne Davis, lead minister of Plymouth Congregational Church, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Plymouth Church. I invite you to make yourself at home with us. Also, I'm just so excited because I see a few of my dear friends in the work of justice, who've inspired me and look after me, and I'm thinking they know who they are, but I'm gonna call their names because I spend a lot of time, most recently in the virtual space, gaining their wisdom and their cooperation. And I'm thinking of Presiding Elder Stacy Smith of the St. Paul, Minneapolis District of the Chicago Annual Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She is here. And I have the pleasure of being on a lot of Zoom calls with her and just crave her wisdom. So glad that she's here. Reverend Dr. Curtis DeYoung is here, Chief Executive Officer of the Minnesota Council of Churches. Again, a dear friend and colleague who I just enjoy working with. And of course, my dear friend, Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. We get together, old Pentecostal boys we are, and we tell stories and enjoy each other's company all the time. And my colleague, Reverend Pamela Gojiri. I am so glad that you all are doing this work with us. You know, we at Plymouth Church count it a great blessing and a testament to God's generous abundance that you all would seek to be in community and communion with us. Oh, we now get to brag because you chose to join us, and we are so grateful that you would do that you would share in this work with us, and that you would bring your work and witness here to Plymouth Church. On behalf of the members and the leadership of Plymouth Church, we welcome you here. I do want to just thank a few people from Plymouth Church. I want to call their names. They have worked with you all to make sure that you are comfortable and to provide as much hospitality and support as you might need, and that is Reverend Seth Patterson, our Minister of Spiritual Formation and Theater, Cody Bordeaux, our production manager, who you've probably seen around here, making sure that we can get all of this technology, and also for our virtual viewers to make sure that you can be present with all of what is happening here. And to all of the volunteers and staff of Plymouth Church who have been working so hard to make sure that you are comfortable. And I do want to just particularly, again, thank Reverend Curtis DeYoung and Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs for looking to us and talking with us about what this could be. And I love the phrase, finally telling the truth. It landed to my ears as a siren song of good news at a time when the veracity of news, of truth, of science is assailed, denied, and distorted for ideological and political purposes. Finally telling the truth. When resistance to confronting the truth of our nation's history has now become a concerted campaign to prevent schools from actually teaching actual history. And you all deign to name your truth-telling event, finally telling the truth. Yeah, that's all right. Let's go ahead. And so I want to thank you for daring to do it. I want to thank you for daring to do it. I just want to let you know, when I was a congressional staffer years ago, at the start of every new session of Congress, the Honorable John Conyers, a U.S. Congressman from Michigan, would introduce a bill to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery. Every session of Congress, he would introduce that bill. And at the start of every new session of Congress, I would dust off my memo recommending to each of the 3 members for whom I worked to co-sponsor the bill. But I remember every time I would dust off that old memo, I would include a line asserting that, oh, this bill probably isn't going to go anywhere. And I would say it didn't mean anything would actually happen if we do pass it. And I would say something like, oh, it would be just a commission that might convene something like a truth-telling and education forum, but not much more than that. I think some part of me was trying to comfort those white men that it wouldn't go further than that. But I could never imagine, because that analysis betrayed my own cynicism, because I could never imagine that there would be anything like a truth-telling and education forum, let alone a congressionally authorized commission to study anything like a formal process of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for the historic harm done to African American and Native American communities. I just couldn't think it could happen. So when I heard from Reverend DeYoung and Reverend Jim Bear about the Minnesota Council of Churches 3-point action platform for dismantling structures and repairing the damage of racism in Minnesota, and when they talked about this event, it is overwhelmingly clear that we are in the middle of a great turning. The Minnesota Council of Churches may very well be the first formal church collectivity in the United States to formally take on this effort of acknowledgement through truth-telling. And I am proud to witness it, and I am just overjoyed that Plymouth Congregational Church can be a part of the effort. Thank you. Thank you for your work. Now, a little bit of housekeeping for our guests here. If you need any of the facilities, it is behind this wall, so you can just go out this door here and take a right, and you will see where the facilities are. If there's anything else that you need, do please make sure that you let us know, and we'll do as much as we can to accommodate your needs. But I just want to, before I take my seat, let's show our appreciation to the Minnesota Council of Churches and to you and to our guests who are looking at this virtually for the work that we are about to undertake and pray God's blessings on it. Thank you. God bless you.
Good evening, everyone. It's so glad to see your sunshiny faces this evening, both in person and online. I am Reverend Pamela Gojiri. I am one of the co-directors at the Minnesota Council of Churches. And I am so excited about our program tonight. My responsibility at this point in time is to introduce Presiding Elder Stacy L. Smith, who is also the president of the Minnesota Council of Churches board. It's my pleasure to do this because she's also my presiding elder and she's my friend. So Reverend Dr. Davis has talked about her, so I won't continue talking about her. But at this point in time, the next voice you'll hear will be that of Presiding Elder Stacy L. Smith. And following her welcome to the event, we will have a song from our choir. Thank you.
Well, good evening once again. I feel you already know who I am, so I can just go and sit down. So like I said, good evening. I am Presiding Elder Stacy Smith, and I am the judicatory head for the African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Minnesota, Iowa, and in Canada. And I'm also the president of the board of the Minnesota Council of Churches, which I am very proud to be. I want to welcome you all here tonight to the launching event of the Minnesota Council of Churches Truth and Reparations work. Tonight's event will introduce you to the truth-telling process, the first of a three-tier project from a Native American perspective as we begin our journey towards community healing. This event is the first of many to come throughout the state, and I'm excited for the work that the Council of Churches is doing at this season. We are breaking ground, we are making new turns, and we are introducing new perspectives to our communities. And so without further ado, I want to ask you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the program for this evening. Thank you.
Amen and amen. I would just like to acknowledge our vocal ensemble. This is the vocal ensemble from St. James AME Church in St. Paul, where Presiding Elder Stacey L. Smith is the pastor and the presiding elder. So if we can give them a hand. And they are very fond of her. But I'd also like to say thank you to all the volunteers that helped this event to come together. We could not have done it without you. I want to thank our funders who have joined us online, and some are here in person, because we certainly couldn't do it without them. And so can we give them a round of applause for all these folks? And that's what this is all about, unity and working together for the common good of humanity. And they have done it well. So just a little, Reverend Dwayne did a housekeeping earlier. So inside your bags, you will find a journal if you want to take a look. And if you open up the journal, inside you will see sticky notes on the left hand on the cover. Those sticky notes will be used later on during the service and tomorrow. So we have what we call a wall of lament and promise. If you step right outside of the sanctuary, you will see it on the wall. What we want you to do is write those things that you're lamenting on one of the sticky notes, or two, or however many you need, and stick it under the sign that says lament. The other thing we want you to do is to write about what promise or commitment you're going to make to this, this happening, this event, this process of restoring healing based on what racial harm has done. Take that and stick it on the side that says promise, okay? So that's, when you leave the service this evening, you can do that. We would appreciate it, and then tomorrow you'll have another opportunity to do the same thing. As we prepare to transition to our program, we are going to show you a short video. So please enjoy it.
Say your name, show your face, leave no trace of your shame. Tears come falling, 500 years. Prayers of our children, late at night, down the hall, monsters scream, roam and crawl. Of our children, say their names, show their faces, leave no traces of their games. Tears stop falling, 500 years. Prayers of our children, prayers of our children. Take these tears.
one question, because I didn't grow up in the black church. When you become presiding elder, does the choir just follow you wherever you go? Because I might want to throw my hat in the ring for that. It's a good perk. I don't know if I qualify, but friends, if we're going to talk about racial justice and systemic inequities, if we're going to finally tell the truth, we're going to get uncomfortable. We're just going to name that. You may hear things tonight from our keynote speaker that is new information for you, may not sit well in your body. I ask you, particularly our white-bodied folks that are present, to lean into that discomfort. However, we don't want to have people harmed in this process. And so we do have tonight, we have trauma specialists that are here and are available. They are seated right over here. If you could all just raise your hand. So if this evening or tomorrow you find yourself in a place where you're just kind of getting trauma locked, you're getting kind of stuck, you're disassociating maybe, we have these specialists available and we have space in the church that is available for someone to help you process your trauma. So we have someone for our African American folks and people of color. We have for Native folks, and then for our white-bodied folks, we have someone there too. So if you need, please make yourself available to that. Our keynote speaker tonight is someone who I would call us friends. We just realized that we only met for the first time in physical space tonight, but we have spent many hours in virtual space just working on a lot of stuff. Christine Dendizi McCleave, you know, I always want to put Dr. Christine Dendizi McCleave, but she's going to get there. She's getting there, folks. Okay? She is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Ojibwe Nation, and she is a leader and an activist for Indigenous rights, advocating for truth, justice, and healing for the genocidal policy of U.S. Indian boarding schools. And you have her incredible bio in your programs. Your programs are also, you probably found them in your little swag bag that you all got. And you all like the logo? Okay. My daughters designed that logo. So 12 and 14, I made them sign a contract. They said, Dad, why don't you just pay us out of your pocket? And I said, because those 3 words, out of my pocket. You sign a contract, I can expense your... You know, friends, Christine is everywhere. Just earlier today, she was on a march for the survivors of residential boarding schools. So this is a woman who I have witnessed in policymakers' offices as well as on the streets. And I think that speaks to her integrity, that she is invited into high spaces of political office, but also when the time arises and the need comes, her feet are on the ground. She's walking in the streets. And I deeply respect that. You know, as Reverend Dwayne said, the Minnesota Council of Churches, to our knowledge, were the first ecumenical body to address truth and reparations in a racial justice setting. And we're certainly, as far as we know, the first to have our focus on two different impact communities, that being American Indians and African Americans. We are, yes. We are intentional about that. And we also recognize that as the Council of Churches, and which has been a historically white organization through most of its history, that if we're going to be real and we're going to be people of integrity in this work, then we have to do the work ourselves. And part of that means restructuring our leadership and our board of directors. And so under the vision of Reverend Curtis DeYoung, we have expanded our board, and as of, was it December now, we are a majority BIPOC-led organization at our board level. And so that meant we had all of these spaces that we could fill with incredible BIPOC people. And when Curtis came to me and said, who from the Native community should we invite to our board? Without hesitation, I said, Christine. Because if we, as institutions of faith, are going to be honest about mitigating and undoing the harm of racialized violence, we have to look face first into the issue of residential boarding schools. It is not an exaggeration to say that every American Indian in this nation knows firsthand the trauma of residential boarding schools. It was so widespread, it is no exaggeration to say it affects every Native person. In my own family, my grandmother is a boarding school survivor. Her father, my great-grandfather, was a survivor of Carlisle Indian School, which wouldn't be surprised if Christine talks about that school a little bit. So I am so pleased to have Christine as a friend. I am even more pleased to have her as a colleague, as a fellow warrior in the fight, and to sit on our board and help us as people of faith hold our feet to the fire and hold us accountable to the promises that we are making. So it is my distinct honor. Would you please join me in welcoming almost Dr. Reverend, or no, not Reverend, almost Dr. Christine Dendizi McCleave.
Thank you, Jim Bear. I think I am going to become a reverend too. Might as well. I'll see if I can get a choir to follow me around. Do this. And there we go. Okay, great. Buju, Indinwe Maganiduk, Diindiisi Indigenikaz, Makinakwaju, Indunjiba, Migizi Indudame. What I just said to you in my traditional language of Anishinaabe-Moan, which is Ojibwe language, was, greetings, my relatives. My name is Blue Jay. I am from Turtle Mountain Reservation, and I am Eagle Clan. I'm also the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. My Christian name is Christine McCleave. I find it interesting that I was named Christine, which means Christ child, and that the Christ was a messenger, and that my Indian name is Diindiisi, which means blue jay, and that that is also a bird that is known for its communication. And so I find these two names very much like a calling that I feel I am here to send a message. And I kept joking with our presiding elder here that I don't think you guys are going to enjoy my talk. Don't think you're going to like what I have to say. And as we know that we are here to tell the truth, listen to the truth, sit with the truth, that it might get uncomfortable. So, I have learned over the years that when I start to feel that trauma in my body, to do some breathing exercises. And so I just remind you, if you have some water, or if you need something, you always have your breath. But water is good medicine too. Our bodies are made of water. You walked in and you passed through a smudge. You're in God's house, so hopefully you've got all the resources you need in case you do start to feel some of those uncomfortable feelings that are going to come up, because we're talking about genocide. We're talking about the loss of life for millions of indigenous people. So I just kept chuckling and saying, no, they're not going to enjoy that video either. So at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, our vision is to have indigenous cultural sovereignty restored. We used to have that, and assimilation and colonization put a stop to that. And that's our vision for the future. When our people are healed, we have that. Oh, see, we've got a little tech issue. And our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that is a result of the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. It took us a few years to get to that very succinct mission statement, as any of you who've worked on mission statements might know. The first one was like a paragraph long and included some, thank you, included some information about, maybe a legal strategy, because we were started by the Native American Rights Fund, and that is the oldest 100% Native law firm in the United States. They were the first. I have to acknowledge that I am the descendant of boarding school survivors. So pictured here on the left is my grandfather, Lawrence Willett. And he attended 2 different boarding schools. First, he was sent to Marty Catholic Indian Boarding School. And then later, he went to Haskell Boarding School. He received his primary education at Marty and his vocational education at Haskell. And he never talked about what happened to him at boarding school. He would simply say, I don't want to talk about it. He would also say that he never wanted to step foot in the Catholic Church again, and he almost did not attend my uncle's wedding, which was in the Catholic Church on our reservation. So we don't know what happened to him there, but we know that it must have been a negative experience for him to say those things. And unfortunately, he passed away when I was a teenager, and so I never got to ask him. But as I grew older, I started asking my mom, my aunts and uncles, other family members, if maybe he had told them, and that was all the information I could get. He would say he didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to go to the church. It was after I started working for the Boarding School Healing Coalition, and I kept asking my family about my grandfather's boarding school experience because I wanted to try to find his records, his school records. It was then that my uncle shared that my great-grandfather, so his father, went to Carlisle Indian Boarding School. Now, he had a different type of experience. He went there from 1910 to 1915, and he arrived there as a 20-year-old man. So he was not a child, and he was recruited by Pop Warner to play football for the Carlisle Indian team. Now, that's a big deal. If any of you are football fans, you know that the Carlisle Indian team changed football. It would not be the sport it is today had not those Indian students revolutionized the game. They invented the forward spiral pass. They invented trick plays. There's a whole book about it called, is it the All-Americans? something like that. There's a book about that team and what they did. They even had footballs sewn onto their uniforms to confuse the other team. So, they did all these things. They did all these things that, that weren't against the rules. And so my great-grandfather actually played football with Jim Thorpe. Now, no one in my family talked about my grandfather's boarding school experience, which was negative, but no one talked about my great-grandfather's boarding school experience, which had some pretty cool bragging rights, because nobody wanted to talk about boarding schools at all. Regardless of the fact that my great-grandfather played football with the legendary Jim Thorpe, I did look up his school files from Carlisle, and they wrote horrible things about him. One of the things that really disturbed me was they said that he wasn't very bright, and that his last year there, he was holding a grudge. And I don't know what that was about, and I used to tell this story, and one time I was telling this story at an event on my reservation, and somebody came up to me and said, I know your family, and I remember at the time, or I remember my grandparents telling me that he was being recruited to the NFL. So the Carlisle Indian football team helped start the National Football League. So you really should read that book if you're a football fan. And he chose to go home to his family in Turtle Mountain rather than to go on and play football. And I can only speculate that maybe that's what he was upset about. Maybe that was his grudge, that he was conflicted. But anyways, I share this just to say that there are so many people with boarding, like Jim Bear said, so many people touched by these boarding school experiences, and a lot of us don't have those stories because our relatives didn't want to talk about it. It was a painful experience, and they didn't want to pass that on. And so we're always encouraging people to share their stories. It's necessary for us to understand what happened to our relatives. And I would say this really applies to all of us. This is not just, Native people or boarding school descendants. This is something that Indigenous peoples knew because we had oral histories that told us, not only going all the way back to our origin stories, our creation stories, but we knew our ancestors, the generations before us. Some people could recite their lineage going back 1,000 years. We knew who we were as Indigenous peoples. We knew how to be in relationship with each other, with the land, with the environment. We had vast knowledge systems, we had government systems, we had plant medicines, we had just so much that did not get recognized through colonizers' worldview. And that knowledge of who we are and where we come from and who we're related to was also taken through the boarding school experience. So it is an act of reclamation, it is an act of healing to know our histories, who we are, who we come from. So I struggled for a long time with the knowledge of the true history in this country. When I was in high school, I took an AP history class, and I wrote a paper about Columbus. And I'll tell you, I graduated high school in '93. So to some of you, I'm old, and some of you, I'm a young whippersnapper, huh? But I read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, and I was horrified at the things that it said about Columbus, which were the truth, about the things he wrote in his diary, about subjugating the people and selling the young girls. And when I was a senior in high school, we staged a walkout on Columbus Day, and I read that paper. And I started to feel a very deep sense of anger and grief and loss about being a Native person. And I used to wonder, why was I born a Native person? This comes with so much pain and suffering. It took another 15 or so years for me to finish my bachelor's degree. In my 20s, I dealt with a lot of my family's historical trauma, how it manifested itself in my life, how it affected the way I showed up for my son, who I had when I was 22. Interestingly, what we now know is that what the boarding schools did was the effects of that were passed down through generations. And as they removed children and set them in these schools, they eventually evolved into the Indian Adoption Project. Now, this is probably later in my slides, but it came up now, so I'm telling you now. And they placed these children directly into white homes because it was cheaper, it was more efficient. And so my great-grandfather and my grandfather went to boarding schools, right? So that's 2 generations. And then my mother, although she didn't go to a boarding school, she was sent to live with another family when she was young on the reservation, but she was not raised by my grandparents. And then when she got pregnant with me, she was sent to an unwed mother's home and told to give me up for adoption. And so when I had my first child, I struggled. I thought, God, I thought my mom was such a terrible mother, and here I am, I don't know how to be a good mother. I thought I could do a better job, but I did not have the parenting skills. And I certainly didn't have any traditional teachings to help me. And I ended up giving custody of my son to his father. So that was 5 generations of child removal. Basically, the message that had been passed down from boarding schools was your children are better off being raised by someone else. And so later I did get custody of my son back. And I was doing my master's degree in leadership, and I just couldn't bring myself to do the thesis on 360-degree feedback on leadership development or something very corporate, because I was working in a corporate environment. And I transitioned, and I decided that I actually left that corporate job. I resigned, and I really was at a low point in my life, which is often when we have breakthroughs, right? And I decided that I wanted to do my research exploring this tension that I had had for my whole life around being raised Catholic, but being Native and knowing what the church on the whole as an institution had done to Indigenous peoples. And there I was in my mid-30s still wrestling with that. And so I did lean into it, and I did this research. So I hate reading this because nowadays I'm like, oh, I should have wrote a better title. But the title of my thesis is Spiritual Leadership in Modern-Day Native American Culture and Approaches to Native American Religion and Christianity. Basically, the comparison, right? My research questions were, what are the areas of compatibility? What are the areas of conflict? And specifically, what role do churches play in Indian activism? Because as I did the lit review, I learned that some of the first Indian activists, like before this country was even an official nation, like in the 1700s, were missionized Indians that had learned to speak English and were part of the churches and would advocate for their community to receive resources. And so I found that very interesting. And essentially, the results of my qualitative study were that the current practices of Native Americans today falls along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you have Native people who are wholeheartedly Christian and do not have any interaction with traditional Native spirituality. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Native people who only practice Native spirituality and don't have anything to do with the church. And then you have a whole bunch of people in the middle blending the theologies and the practices to varying degrees. And that's where most people fall. Those two extremes, I found, had very little tolerance for each other. There were very evangelical perspectives on one extreme that said certain aspects of Native culture were non-biblical, demonic, and evil. And then there were those traditional natives who said, I don't want anything to do with the church because of their role in genocide. But those who were practicing blending to varying degrees had much more tolerance for the other perspectives, the diverse perspectives, and found a lot of areas of compatibility. The Native American church was founded on that synchronistic idea that the traditional plant medicine that was used to create visions was the flesh of God. And in their ceremonies, it was the Eucharist. And interestingly enough, the Native American Church was instrumental in passing the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which I always laugh at and find very ironic that we had to form a church, we had to form ourselves a Christian church to get our religious freedom. Food for thought, huh? So the conclusions of my research: the history of the church and Native Americans cannot be overlooked, and in fact must be addressed for the well-being and spiritual health of Native people. Church leaders who continue to teach that Native American culture is non-biblical or evil definitely are perpetrating the cultural genocide and human rights violations of the Indian boarding schools and other Christians who've criminalized Native religion. And taking an active role in reconciliation and reparations as a spiritual leader can help heal generational trauma caused by boarding schools and other historical trauma, and can produce healthy Native Americans inside and outside the church. So I applaud you all for being here tonight. And then finally, when I wrote my recommendations, obviously they were based on those conclusions that spiritual leaders inside and outside of the church need to acknowledge this history. And I found this one quote particularly interesting, and it was anonymous. All I know is that it was somebody speaking at a Native American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies. I hope someday somebody tells me who said this. But it says, for Native peoples to follow Jesus, they can best do so not by becoming Christian, but by following their traditional ways. Any religion that is based on exclusivist notions of salvation necessarily becomes a religion tied to conquest and empire. So Jim Bear was saying, you know, I'm going to be a doctor someday because I'm currently a doctoral student, and I just started this semester, so I appreciate your enthusiasm saying I'm almost a doctor. But I'm enrolled in the Indigenous Studies program at University of Alaska Fairbanks, taking it online so I don't have to move to Alaska. And one of my classes this semester is Indigenous Knowledge Systems, and we began by talking about colonization and empire. Now, a lot of times, I think we've become pretty comfortable with the term colonization, at least I am. I mean, I think it's used a lot more commonly now. And I think a lot of people in this country who are not Native are willing to accept that, yes, Indigenous people were colonized, that this country was colonized, and colonization took place all around the world, right? So we all are on the same page there. But then when you take it a step further and you say it was tied to empire, not everyone can take that next step in acknowledging that, but it's the truth. When we look at the doctrine of discovery, that papal bull that says if you encounter lands that are inhabited by non-Christian people, you can claim that land for the cross and the crown. That was not just the church there. making that proclamation. That was definitely tied to empire of those European countries that were competing against each other for riches and wealth and control. So we have to acknowledge that these things are tied. There's lots of examples throughout the history of all the churches where we see empire being spread in the name of God. And I finally, after doing this thesis, did have some healing because I realized I do love Jesus. I just don't like what his followers have done. So I'm going to fly through this a little bit more quickly than I intended because that opening was, I don't know, divinely inspired? No. It wasn't what I had planned on saying, but it was what came to my mind. So I'm going to give you a quick lesson in Indian boarding school history, the impacts, and the healing that's going on. And we start out looking at historical trauma. That is a term that was coined by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. And the definition, she came to speak at our 2018 conference. She was our keynote, and she said, oh, I feel like I mislabeled this term. Everybody thinks historical trauma is in the past. I should have named it something different. Because the definition says the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. So my historical trauma includes not only what happened to my mother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, all my ancestors, but what happened in my lifetime too. And so when you look at the DSM manual of diagnoses for mental health professionals, you know, they have one for post-traumatic stress disorder. They have one for certain just trauma, right? They don't have one for historical trauma. And so I'm not ashamed to tell you, I've been to years of counseling and therapy, and I've talked to multiple therapists about this issue. And I remember one saying, well, I think what you have that's in the DSM manual is called complex trauma. In other words, I have layers of trauma. A lot of us do. And I would also say that the entire world now has historical trauma after living through a global pandemic. I remember reading an article last year that talked about surge capacity and how we were all depleted because when you face a threat, you get this surge of adrenaline, your fight or flight. But when the threat is ongoing and you don't know when it's going to end, that, you get adrenal fatigue because you're constantly, on alert. And I just remember reading that article and having her talk about this, loss of lives, loss of vital aspects of our culture, having everything just taken away from us and not being able to move about and proceed with our lives as usual, and how nobody had ever experienced that, and I got angry. And I said, well, this was obviously written by a non-native person. And I found a meme, because I love memes. I found a meme on social media that was making fun of this fact that said, everybody freaking out about the pandemic and, civil uprisings and this and that. And it was actually the photo of, what's his name, Joaquin from The Joker, and where he's like sitting there smoking a cigarette, and they're like, native people, oh, you wouldn't understand, because this is not our first rodeo. Welcome to our world. Okay, so now we've got the term historical trauma, and there's this phenomenon where Western science validates what indigenous peoples know and what we have known for millennia. But we call epigenetics blood memory. We know that things are passed down through your DNA. But Dr. Rachel Yehuda did a Western science study to prove it with empirical data that and she found that the survivors of the Holocaust were passing PTSD down to their children. So she reproduced the study and looked at women who were pregnant and present at the 9/11 attacks, and those children who experienced it in utero later had the same genetic markers as somebody with PTSD. And she did it one last time. The third one was with war veterans, and same thing. Their children had PTSD from their experiences. So now we have the proof, because some people didn't want to believe indigenous peoples, and it's called epigenetics. We also know from the ACEs study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, which was done back in the 80s and on a largely upper middle class white group of respondents or surveys, participants. And what they found was that out of 10 ACEs, 10 adverse childhood experiences that they listed, if someone suffered 4 or more of those as a child, that when they grew up, they were more likely to have negative health outcomes as an adult. And those included mental health issues, chemical dependency, heart disease, diabetes, and early death. So that's an interesting study, why the childhood experiences would cause things like diabetes or heart disease in adulthood. And it's because when a child's brain is still developing and it experiences trauma, it changes some wiring and some neurobiology. That's also the other class I'm taking this semester, which is fascinating. So it rewires the child's brain. And we know that this trauma then manifests itself in autoimmune diseases in adulthood. Okay, some of them are behavioral, like the addictions, right? But some of them are literally, the nervous system has been damaged. Now think about this for a second. Native Americans have so many disparities. We're winning in all the categories. We're winning all the negative categories, right? Suicide, poverty, low educational attainment, diseases, suicide, violence. Why? We didn't do that to ourselves. The government stole our children, traumatized them, and here we are. I'm not angry at you because you're here listening to me, but I'm angry because so many people don't understand that. So many people in this country have not heard the truth. We've been telling lies about the origins of this country, about what happened to the indigenous people, about slavery, about institutional racism. There's a painting in the hallway out there, that depicts a Thanksgiving scene. We know that is a lie. That's the fable of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and the Indians sitting down to eat. They did have a feast. But then later, they massacred those Indians. Why don't we tell that part of the story? Well, that's rhetorical, right? Why don't we tell the truth about genocide in this country? Because people have things they will lose. It's tied to empire and control and money and land. So after a child is taken to boarding school and they grow up, and as an adult they have these issues, they produce an environment, even if their children don't go to boarding school, where that child will likely suffer those childhood traumas and grow up to have ACEs, and the cycle continues, and that's the intergenerational portion of the trauma. But the good news is, I love this quote by Kazu Haga, if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our DNA. And I like to add, because I'm Indigenous and this is our beliefs, that our ancestors are with us and providing us that strength to get through this. So Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart also came up with 4 easy steps to heal your trauma. I like to make fun of that because it's messy, it's not linear, it takes a lifetime, it's probably never really done, but for the sake of having a nice framework, this one makes a lot of sense to me. Number 1, you have to confront the historical trauma. Then you have to understand it. Then you can release the pain, and then you can transcend or transform. Right? Easy peasy. I don't think so. Confront it. Oh my gosh, we suck at that. As individuals, as families, as communities, as a nation, we are not confronting the truth. Well, we are in this space right here. But not enough of it is happening. And until we do that, we can't heal, we can't change, we can't move forward. We'll be stuck repeating the past. Because only when we confront it can we begin to understand it. I think I would have had another slide. I always have this problem when I talk. I go out of order from my slides, but if I could magically insert a slide here, it would be to set the current environment in context. First, we entered into a global pandemic, which brought the world to a halt and put everyone on a level playing field. And we all realized how interconnected we were as a global family. We were all having a shared experience. We were all experiencing grief, fear, and loss. And I believe that this set the stage for the outcry that happened after the murder of George Floyd. It was like a perfect storm. Sadly, how many African Americans had been murdered by the police prior to George that did not spur a civil uprising or a global movement? To see how it rippled outside of Minneapolis, across the nation, and around the world was a powerful moment. And then the response to say, we have to change. Society has to change. We need to look at the institutional racism. We need to look at how to advance racial justice and racial equity. And a lot of us who had been doing this work for a long time were like, yeah, good, yes. Come. But so many more people were just awakening. And that couldn't have happened if it wasn't for COVID. I don't know why. I just know it's a fact. So then, yeah, I'm going way out of order for my slides, so just forgive me. Right before the pandemic in February of 2020, I was in Washington, D.C. for the National Congress of American Indians, and I had a meeting with then Representative Deborah Haaland and told her about our coalition, told her about our work, said we need a truth commission on Indian boarding schools. And in September of 2020, she introduced a bill for a Truth and Healing Commission on boarding schools. Again, yes. Again, that would not have happened had it not been for the Black Lives Matter movement and all the raised awareness and activism that had happened after the murder of George Floyd. In fact, there is a slide, I'll point it out to you when we get there, but there's a slide that says, Haaland introduced the bill right after the president at the time said he was going to sign an executive order about not teaching propaganda in our schools. And so that was her response. And I have to tell you, I never thought that a commission bill would be introduced that soon. I mean, the coalition was formed in 2012, and people had been doing this work for decades. And we thought we had a lot more time. We did not think it was going to happen this fast. And then, okay, so that bill didn't go anywhere because it was an election year, and we were experiencing all that political theater. And the bill just didn't get the attention that it deserved, which was very sad and disheartening. Again, why can we not confront the genocide that we've committed in this country? And then Haaland, or Auntie Deb as I like to call her, got appointed as the Secretary of the Interior, the first Native American to ever be the Secretary of the Interior, a historic moment. And Auntie Deb continued to champion this issue because when the news of unmarked graves started to hit our screens and monitors and airwaves, she launched the initiative for the Department of the Interior to investigate Indian boarding schools. And any day now, we're going to reintroduce the bill for a Truth and Healing Commission. We're working with Representative Davids, Sharice Davids, and Senator Warren. Senator Warren co-sponsored the bill with Haaland last year. So again, that's the container that we're working in, right? That's the current environment. Would we have paid as much attention to the news of the unmarked graves in Canada had we not had the experience that we had with the murder of George Floyd? Would we have had any of those experiences had we not experienced our own humanity through the pandemic? Somebody set it up. This is way bigger than me as a CEO. This is way bigger than one nonprofit or its coalition membership. This is a spiritual movement. I have seen miracles happen while doing this work. And I know that it is the result of the millions of prayers. Think about how many mothers, fathers, aunties, uncles, grandmas, grandpas prayed when those children were taken. How many of those children cried and prayed nightly for their families or for the abuse to stop? This is a spiritual movement. Another interesting shift that I noticed this year. Oh, I need to tell you, we don't say that those graves were discovered. Words are powerful and important because the communities and the relatives knew they were there. In fact, the Canadian government knew they were there. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. and they heard the testimony, and it's in the report. And the government declined to give money to locate them. So the communities had to do it on their own. And that's why 6 years after the commission ended, we heard that news. So that is to say that a truth commission is not the end-all be-all, but it is a beginning. And we need one. But it will just be the beginning of our work. So children have been being repatriated from the Carlisle Indian School Cemetery. Carlisle was the first off-reservation federal Indian boarding school. There had been boarding schools before, schools, day schools, mission schools. Some of them were on the reservation or nearby, and the children would run away and go home. Who wouldn't? So they had this idea that they would move them and take them far away, too far for them to be able to run home, although many of them tried, and not all of them made it. So Carlisle was, I took out the slides, but Carlisle was started by a military man named Pratt, and he's the one who coined the term, kill the Indian, save the man. And he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses, because at the time he really thought he was doing the good Christian thing. And I had a quote in there from him saying, a good general has said that, something about Indian massacres and the only good Indian is a dead one, and in a way I agree with him, but only in this, that we should kill all the Indian in him and save the man. So he thought he was doing the right thing, didn't realize it was still genocide. What he was setting up was an experiment in cultural genocide, which according to the United Nations definition is still genocide. So when relatives started asking for those children who were buried in Carlisle, and there are over 215 children who were originally buried there, to be returned home, originally the Army said no, and they said some really insulting things about the graveyard being a tourist attraction and having international visitors, and so eventually, though, the family kept trying, and they finally agreed. So in 2017, the first repatriations happened. And it might be too small for you to read, but it's also on our website at boardingschoolhealing.org. And so each year, except for 2020, there were repatriations that took place. But what's the interesting thing is that this year, this summer, in 2021, the repatriations produced a much more extensive impact. I watched video of these children being returned to the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota with a caravan of 400 cars behind them. And as they were brought into the assembly hall, people sang and cried and smudged and wailed, and that unresolved grief that we've been carrying for centuries was able to come out. We didn't see such huge welcoming ceremonies for the other children in prior years, but something has shifted. We're going to have our, hopefully, in-person conference next year. And the theme is going to be the awakening. That is the era we are in. Things are changing. So although we recognize the trauma and the grief, which is important, we also recognize that Indigenous people are resilient and strong. We are some of the most resilient people on the planet. They tried to genocide us, and we're still here. So if we acknowledge the pain and we acknowledge that we are resilient peoples and we seek justice as we tell the truth, what does that look like? I have this slide on here because I did some research and have been studying truth and reconciliation models, and I could give you a whole nother keynote about the word reconciliation. Jim and Curtis know that I kicked off some of the work we did with the city of Minneapolis around their truth and reconciliation efforts with a big fat question about why the word reconciliation. Indigenous peoples don't really resonate with that word. It's definitely a colonizer's word. I believe it has biblical origins, and there's no consensus on what it means. So, if we are to have truth and reconciliation, how do we go from the truth to being reconciled, whatever that is? Something seems to be missing in the middle there, right? And that is justice. What happens after the truth is told? What actions are taken? So there are models of justice from academia, which has its merits, as I'm going to get a PhD. Retributive justice focuses on punishment. Restorative justice goes a little further to try and, I guess, reconcile people to each other, right? Perpetrator and victim. Transitional justice is what academia is really focusing on now. And that speaks to governments reckoning with their human rights violations or crimes against humanity and trying to transition to a new state. I like to take it a step further and say, yeah, let's transform. Let's have transformative justice. Let's not just transition to what could be another problematic paradigm, but let's truly transform as a society and as a humanity. One of the interesting things about transitional and transformative justice theories is that after you tell the truth and you hear that truth from both sides, perpetrators and victims, and you make reparations, try to repair the damage either with redress, monetary values, or by actually fixing what was broken, the most important step is the promise not to repeat the harms. Because although there was a lot of legislation in the 70s that changed the way Indian boarding schools run, and there are still Indian boarding schools today, there's 73 of them open across the country today. They now promote language and culture because of the self-determination era. We had to have special legislation to protect our children from being removed through the Indian Child Welfare Act, to protect our religious freedoms, to say we wanted to protect our languages. We needed special laws to reverse the government's initial policies to prohibit our language and culture and take our children. So although boarding schools are different today, our children are still being targeted and they are still being removed. But now it's through the foster care system. And the Indian Child Welfare Act is under attack. People are trying to have it ruled unconstitutional, saying it's race-based, but it's not. We have political status. I'm a dual citizen of the United States and of my tribal nation. These acts of legislation are not race-based. They are based on a political identity of sovereigns living in this country. So yes, our children are still being removed. They are represented at higher rates per capita than any other ethnicity across the country, no matter what county you check the stats on. In Alaska, Alaska Natives are 25% of the population, but Alaska Native children are 50% of the children in the foster care system. I can't remember what the stats are here in Minnesota. I want to say we're like 2% of the population and we're 19% of the kids in foster care. But I'm not sure if that's exactly right. But I know there's a disparity there. So the harm is still ongoing. And the efforts to attack ICWA are now being bolstered by big oil companies. What do they have to do with Indian children? Well, if they can get ICWA declared unconstitutional, then all the other Indian legislation falls with it. And then guess what big oil gets access to? Our lands. It's always been about the land. The boarding schools were the United States' most effective tactic in their strategy to get our lands. Because right after the initial policies to establish boarding schools, we had the Dawes Act, which broke up our lands, and we lost 90 million acres of what had been promised in the treaties, 2/3 of our land base. We are in a new era. Now we've got the land back movement. Anybody watch Reservation Dogs on Hulu? One of my favorite scenes is the couple driving in the car and they go, "What's that mean, land back? You suppose they want all of it back or just some of it?" So if Canada already had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and they're still dealing with this issue, how do we make sure that if we have a Truth Commission, we do a better job? That was also rhetorical. I'm going to skip this. We're trying to find the records. Okay, I will tell you this. I'm going to wrap it up here soon. So in 2016, we went to the government and filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and said, we want to know how many children went to boarding schools. How many boarding schools did the US have? And how many children died or went missing? What happened to those children? What tribal nations did they come from? We asked a bunch of questions in our FOIA request. And the response was that they don't do research. They could not fulfill our request. In fact, they closed it without even corresponding with us, and it was a reporter that found out for us that they had closed it. So we went and did independent research, and we have found 367 schools to date, and people have been reporting more schools recently, but we haven't been able to verify, so this number might change. But right now we know for sure we've verified 367 Indian boarding schools in this country. We still don't know how many children went to those schools. Canada had their Truth Commission, and they had 139 residential schools. And 100,000 children went to those schools, and approximately 4,000 died or went missing. So when I get asked by reporters on the numbers in the United States, I have to tell them, we don't know, nobody knows, the government doesn't know. But you could just double the numbers as an estimate. So that means we had over 200,000 children likely, and over 8,000 children who died or went missing. But we don't know, and we need those answers. In 2016, I made a poster that says, "We deserve the truth." And then in 2018, I went to the United Nations and I realized we have a right to the truth. The Human Rights Council said. So where are the records for these 367 schools? The truth will be compiled based on those records and the testimony from survivors and descendants. But we have only been able to locate the records for approximately 38% of the schools on the list, and then we don't even know if those are all the records. The federal government has records at their national archives. So those are the low-hanging fruit. We know where those are. we can get access. The rest, we believe, are in church archives, historical societies, museums, personal collections, libraries. We need the church bodies to find the records. I get approached by a lot of well-intentioned church folks, either at a congregational level or denominational level. And they always want to rush towards reconciliation. How can we have truth and reconciliation? They want to be absolved, right? And I say, we still don't have the truth. We can't move past that. We don't have the truth. Find your records. Bring forth your records. Okay, here's the slides. Yeah, the timing of the bill's introduction was intentional. That patriotic education plagued with racism, right? So the investigation from Auntie Deb is focusing on boarding school sites and cemeteries and potentially unmarked graves. Her report is due April of 2022. That's not enough time. 367 schools. We've been working on this for 10 years, and granted, the federal government has a few more resources than we do, but this is too big. It's not going to be wrapped up by April. I can tell you that the report is going to say more investigation is needed. What a truth commission would do is build on that. What the Interior is not doing is collecting testimony. In Canada, they did regional hearings where they had survivors and descendants come and share their testimony. And one of our board members was an honorary witness, and I just remember hearing her stories. They had options for whether survivors wanted to stand in front of a large assembly and talk at a microphone, or if they wanted to go into a private room, if they wanted it to be recorded or anonymous. They took great measures to care for people because they knew they were going to be triggering people's trauma. They had counselors, clergy, and traditional healers available for people. As a coalition, we just don't have the resources to do that, so we haven't been able to collect widespread testimony. But boarding school survivors are usually elders, and they're aging and they're passing on. So there is urgency to collecting their stories and honoring their memories and their experiences. The bill that we helped draft this summer that should be introduced any day, like I said, we're just waiting on the legislators, will be for a 5-year commission. Now, last year when that bill got introduced, Hallen sent us the draft, and it said an 18-month commission. And we said, that's not enough. Canada had 5 years, and they had half as many schools. We want 5 years. And she said, they're just not going to go for it. The bill's not going to pass. We negotiated up to, I think they gave us 3 years. We had to fight hard for that. They were like 2 years, and we were like, no, 3. So I think we ended up getting it introduced for 3 years. Now people understand, yes, this has to be a 5-year commission.
Yeah, here we go. Mute.
So I did cover a lot of this already. I guess I just want to focus a little bit on the other things that the coalition is doing besides. We are working with the Department of the Interior, sharing our research. I did tell them, by the way, hey, you know what? We filed a FOIA request and we asked y'all for this information, and now you want it from us. Okay, well, let's just have a moment to acknowledge that, and then, okay, we'll help you. We'll share our research with you because we want the investigation to yield results. But that was a bit of an irony there. So we are having a virtual summit in November. We had a virtual summit last year. It was a 1-day summit. We're expanding it to a 2-day summit this year. And I would encourage you all to join in on that, where we will have a panel of boarding school survivors, and we will also hear, hopefully, from some legislators on the introduction of that bill. We also are working with the University of Minnesota to produce an academic study with empirical data, because lots of people find value in that, rather than just our anecdotal data from people's stories. So we've got a survey, an anonymous survey, asking people about Indian child removal through adoption, foster care, and boarding schools. We're aiming for 1,000 respondents, and we're very close. So we'll be closing the survey soon, and then my hope is in 2022 we publish that report. The interesting thing is that we partnered with these academics at the university, and they did identify us as the community partner, right? Because they don't have the PhD credentials. They are really trying to honor our indigenous wisdom and letting us lead the study. So we formulated the survey to not only ask about the potentially traumatic experiences that were had, but also asking people about healing. So I'm really excited to dig into the data on that and share that with people on how we are healing and moving forward. We also created a scholarship for descendants of boarding school survivors this past year, and right now we are matching donations for those scholarships. So if you're interested in having your dollars doubled, go to boardingschoolhealing.org and donate. One of the things that we find very important in the whole context of decolonization and re-indigenizing things when it comes to interactions with tribal nations and indigenous people is that there are a few different concepts that have to be acknowledged and followed. One is tribal data sovereignty, because traditionally academics would come into Native communities, and on the whole, academia is pretty extractive and, you know, very self-centered on the researcher trying to make a name for themselves. And so tribal data sovereignty, first, tribal sovereignty is the inherent authority of indigenous tribes to govern themselves. And data sovereignty is tribal data sovereignty is the right of indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. So when we're doing work with tribal nations, we follow tribal data sovereignty. And when we talk about our vision to restore our indigenous cultural sovereignty, that includes the right to set the terms of healing and reconciliation. And you'll notice we named the bill Truth and Healing Commission, not Truth and Reconciliation. So what can you do if you want to get involved? Well, you can join the coalition. Membership is free. You can follow us on social media. You can sign up on our website for e-news. And when that bill gets introduced, you can write to your legislators, and you can tell all your friends and family to learn about this issue and to join the coalition and to engage in this truth and healing process. Thank you.
Before we close our evening for some question and answer time. So I have a floating microphone here for the room, and for our Zoom audience, we're going to ask that you would type any questions that you have into the Q&A feature. Is that correct? Type it into the Q&A feature. We have someone who is logged into the virtual world with you, monitoring that, and we will relay questions from that space. So we have some time for some Q&A, so either in the room or in the virtual world.
Okay, from Sandy Kellen. Could you say more, please, about the 73 boarding schools still open, and especially the 15 still boarding?
Yes. So this list is available on our website, and we're currently working on a digital map. We're partnering with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They are the organization that basically now carries on the work of the commission. And they had a digital map of the boarding schools in Canada. And then they took it down, and we asked them, we wanted to do our own, and we said, where did yours go, and how did you do it? And they said, we're actually redoing it. And we said, you want to do one together? So there's going to be a new map coming out, an interactive map where you'll be able to look at the boarding schools that were in Canada, in US, and you can toggle on and off. But for now, we have this list, and there's a lot of data behind it that we haven't published yet, that we're hoping to publish in this next year, about which schools were run by the federal government, which ones were run by the churches, what their dates of operation were, if there are buildings still standing, if it's still open, if there's a cemetery. You get the picture. We're building these profiles. Well, it's taken so long, not only to get the list in the first place, but to get all that extra information gathered. And so this is a little bit incomplete. Again, because we've never had that Truth Commission. I mean, thankfully now the Interior is doing some research, and so we will know more after that report comes out, but this information is incomplete. So what I will tell you is certain is that 73 of the 367 are schools that are still open today, but only 15 of them still board. So for example, the Red Cloud Indian boarding school on the Pine Ridge Reservation used to be a boarding school, but is now just a day school. But it is still open, and it is still a Catholic Indian boarding school. And so when we see the 14 denominations and the numbers, that is where we're not quite sure if that's accurate, because I would say a third of the list we have not been able to confirm whether it was government run or church run. So those numbers under the denominations might change, but we know for certain that the Catholics ran the most of those schools. That probably won't change. I believe there was a lady in the back who raised her hand too.
I so appreciate you're putting this into the context of the pandemic and what just felt like it broke open. You were talking about an event of returning home, something I didn't understand. 400 people were welcoming these folks, and because I'm sitting back here, I couldn't see the slide. But could you explain what that was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the term repatriation is when remains of the deceased are returned. And what's interesting is we call these repatriations from Carlisle, but the Army does not. Because, why the Army? Because Carlisle is on an Army barracks. When the Carlisle Indian School was formed, it was an abandoned barracks, and so the federal government said Pratt could start his experiment there. But today, it's the Army War College, and there's that cemetery there with the Indian children buried. And the reason they don't call it repatriation is because there's an act called the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which requires the repatriations to go through tribal consultation. And so in order to, I mean, from the Army's perspective, they're saying, oh, to expedite the process, we won't make you go through that whole thing. But I'm more skeptical, of course, and believe that it's also because they want to avoid the provision in NAGPRA law that says they have to do an environmental scan. What's interesting is that the Carlisle Cemetery was moved in 1927, and it was moved to build a parking lot. So when they moved the cemetery, some of the wooden caskets fell apart and remains spilled out. And so the cemetery where it is right now has markers, headstones that say unknown, which is not just disrespectful, but just horrific. That why would they not know who is buried there? And it's because they moved the cemetery and they lost track of some of the remains. So that is what we mean when we say repatriation, that the remains of those children who died at Carlisle Indian School were finally sent home.
We have time for one or two more questions, either from in-house or out of house.
Is there any such thing as a boarding school today that's, holistic or doing something positive, or is that an oxymoron?
No, that's a good question. I mean, it kind of is an oxymoron, but there are some schools that, after the self-determination legislation in the 70s, the schools were turned over to the tribes to be run. Some of them are still run by the federal government through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education. But some of them, like the Santa Fe Indian School, are run by the Pueblo governors, which are the tribal leaders for those Pueblo nations. And the Santa Fe Indian School is a pretty elite school. It's a boarding school focused on art. It's an art school. And they do teach language and culture, and a lot of parents actually want their children to go there. But what they don't do is necessarily acknowledge the legacy. Haskell is another example. It was a boarding school, and then a vocational school, and then a junior college, and now it's a university. And they do acknowledge their history. They have a museum on campus that talks about its boarding school history. So it's a complicated subject. I would say some of these schools are doing positive things. It really depends. Chamawa was the second federal off-reservation Indian boarding school that was open in Salem, Oregon. And it's run by the BIE. And, there's different perspectives on whether or not it's a good school or how they're doing. It all depends. I think the most important thing, just like my thesis that said, the church has to acknowledge its history and its actions, these boarding schools, whether they're teaching the language nowadays, and most of them are, and promoting culture, they still need to acknowledge the legacy and the origins of Indian boarding schools.
Leon asks, have you taken any lessons from the South African Truth and Reconciliation process to inform your approach to truth and healing?
Yes. We've looked at a lot of TRCs around the world. So obviously the South African TRC is one of the more famous ones because I don't know if it was the exact first, but it was definitely the first that caught global attention. And we have been informed by the former commissioners from Canada. They've been advising us all along. There was one of the commissioners from the Maine Wabanaki TRC is on our board. In this process this summer with the city of Minneapolis, we also looked at the Greensboro TRC. We've looked at, we know there's a truth commission going on in Colombia right now, and the Sami people of Finland, Norway, and Sweden are also in the process of having a truth commission. So yes, we have looked at a lot of different truth commissions around the world. What's interesting about the South African TRC is that they reached out to Chief Willie Littlechild, who was a commissioner for the Canadian TRC. And he told me when we were writing this bill for our truth commission, he said, they called me and they said, we wish we would have done it the way you guys did it. You guys in Canada did it really well because you made it culturally relevant. Remember when I said they were collecting testimony in these regional hearings and that they made sure that they had traditional healers there. So that was one interesting perspective that we got. And what we know is that South Africans now want another commission. The work from the first one is not done. And so, like I said earlier, a Truth Commission is not the end of our work, it's the beginning.
Christine, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Christine. A memory came to me as Christine was presenting. Recently, I was going through some old stuff, junk and photos and things like that, and I found a photo of my grandmother that I absolutely adore. She's holding, I think, my first daughter, my oldest, and she's got this bright up smile. Just smile lights up the whole room. And but the picture is taken from the side. It's not a direct on. It was a photograph that was caught, if you will, kind of in surprise. So Grandma didn't know that her photo was being taken. And it's unique because usually when my grandma had her photograph taken, she looked like this. She would always look down at the ground, and it was a source of comedy in the family because from some of the earliest pictures, even in some of her, her wedding pictures, she's looking down, and so we would always good-naturedly tease her about it, and we'd say, Grandma, we want to get a good picture, so we're going to put the camera right on your shoes and point it up at you. And I made fun of her I can't even count how many times, and she would laugh and punch me in the arm, the way loving grandparents do. And then a number of years ago, I was sitting in the audience at a play about the doctrine of discovery. And in one scene of this play, it is an intake scene of a residential boarding school. And so they have an actor who's playing a young child who has just been taken from her family and is going through the process of entering into this boarding school. And the process didn't always follow this pattern, but very often it did. The children would be stripped naked, their hair would be cut, their special family and traditional items would be taken from them. They'd be scrubbed down with a harsh soap, and then their photo would be taken. And as this actor is acting out this scene, there's this moment where I saw a very recognizable image as her head dropped. And then the headmaster or whoever was in charge violently grabbed her head, pointed it up at the camera, and the lights flashed. And in that moment, it occurred to me that my grandmother, at the age of 5 years old, very likely the very first time she ever had her photograph taken was her intake photograph for the boarding school. And of course it never sat right with her to have her picture taken. And of course the only way we could get her to smile is if we snuck up on her. She didn't know. And so Christine, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Not just the work of informing churches and communities but the work of bringing healing to our people. Friends, I hope that this night has been as enriching for you as it has been for me. We thank you so much. We look forward to gathering again tomorrow, where we will hear what is bound to be an incredible keynote from Dr. Uhuru Williams. We will have a panel later in the afternoon. Registration will open at 8:30 tomorrow morning. We will have some light, snacky, breakfasty kind of things out there for you. And so we thank you very much. And I'm desperately trying to find my place on this run of show, just so that I can make sure I'm not that I'm not forgetting anything. There I am. It's so hard when you're like pretending to be this polished professional speaker that wants to make eye contact with everyone, and you're lost and you're in this tiny moment of panic. Friends, as you leave tonight, we encourage your reflection, we encourage your contemplation, your meditation, reminding you again that inside the journals that you all got are the sticky notes. You can utilize one color for what are you lamenting, and use the second color for what are the promises you're committing to carry forward. And if you'd like to take a moment as we close out the evening and maybe write some of those reflections as you exit through from our space this evening, you'll see that wall immediately just kind of off to your left. And we just ask that you would put those sticky notes on there, and we have big plans for those sticky notes in the future. So thank you very much. Again, thank you, Christine. This has been very informative, and I know what you mean when you get up in a space and you say, I don't think you're going to like what I have to say, but it is desperately needed. And sometimes medicine makes us gag a little bit. And we just received a dose of medicine. So again, join me in thanking Christine, and please enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.